Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. What drives the Trump administration's foreign policy? It's a question that we've asked many times on this program, and the answer is often America first, which can lead to a spate of second-order questions. But instead of conceptual ideas, it could be that one of the organizing principles of Trump's foreign policy is actually entirely physical, tangible, and simple: access to critical minerals. In this school of thought, Trump's interest in taking over Canada and Greenland, or his desire for deals with Ukraine or Pakistan, goes some way towards explaining policy choices that might not otherwise make sense. In a moment, we will speak with a top expert on critical minerals to understand what they are, why they matter, and how they are influencing foreign policy. If this is your first time joining us on FP Live, welcome. We will take some subscriber questions as always, and if you would like to join in, use the code FP Live for a discount. Once you subscribe, you can also access our FP collection, The Scramble for Critical Minerals, with access to all of the great essays we've run on the site. And as a reminder, FP Live is also a podcast. Find it on your favorite audio platform. Make sure you hit follow. So, what are critical minerals? How are they processed? And why does China have such a stronghold on them? Joining me now is Gracelin Baskaran, Director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gracelin, welcome to FP Live.
Ravi, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with some basic definitions. What are critical minerals?
It's a great question now that we talk about them all the time. So critical minerals are the minerals that we need for national security, economic security, and energy security, but are also at high likelihood of a supply chain disruption. Sometimes we think this means that China controls it, but it could also be that there's a single mine in one country that is producing all of it. And if there was a disruption to that mine, it could undermine our supply chain security.
Hmm. And I often hear the term rare earths. Just explain to us where they fit into this. They're a subset, right?
Absolutely. So we in the US now have identified what we put about 60 critical minerals on a list from the US Geological Survey. Of those, 17 are what we call rare earths. And rare earths are not actually rare, they're everywhere. But the difficulty is where can we find them in a concentration that is dense enough to make them economic to extract? And those rare earths are often found in groups, which is why they tend to be mined together.
And what are the main uses of rare earths and critical minerals? Why are they so important? Why are we talking about them?
So rare earths have really entered discourse because we use them in permanent magnets, and those permanent magnets are used in every form of defense technology: fighter jets, warships, tanks, lasers, missiles. So if we don't have access to them, it actually undermines our ability to protect ourselves, which leaves us really nervous at a time when there is rising geopolitical tension, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Now, critical minerals at large, we use in virtually everything. If we often say if we don't grow it, we dig it. And that's because they are used in every form of consumer technology, every form of energy, which makes it crucial to our very existence.
And just so we can get a grip on how much this tends to get used, so there are critical minerals in a smartphone, in an internal combustion car, also in an electric vehicle. How much would you estimate we use of these minerals in devices or automobiles like that?
So I'm from Detroit, so I think a lot about it through the auto industry lens. And if you think about a gasoline powered vehicle, it uses about 32 kilograms of critical minerals. When I think about an electric vehicle, it uses 210. That's a six-fold increase. And some of these are minerals that we've never really thought a lot about. I'll give you an example with graphite. Your conventional gasoline powered vehicle uses 0 kilograms of graphite. But when I go to that EV, it uses about 62 kilograms. That's 1.2 times my body weight of a mineral I've never thought about. So in some ways, this energy transition that we're looking at globally actually uses new minerals that we haven't needed in significant quantities before, but that we need a lot of now.
Hmm. So I guess this then begs the question, who are the main producers of all of these critical minerals? Which countries are the big power players?
So when we look globally, there's this kind of misconception that China produces all the minerals. They actually, when I think about my big minerals like rare earths, cobalt, copper, lithium, nickel, graphite, China is actually only the top three producer for two of those. But they're a top three producer or processor for all six, which means minerals from Africa and Latin America have historically gone to China for processing. But when we think about which are the producer countries, some of the biggest lithium and copper producers are countries like Chile, Argentina. When I think about things like platinum group metals, that's going to be South Africa. When we look at cobalt, it's the DRC. But the challenge is ultimately most of these minerals will go back to China for processing, which gives them supply chain control.
Hmm. And then, in terms of processing, talk a little bit about the numbers here, because China, of course, has a huge monopoly in processing, but also that's divided up between sort of the heavy critical minerals and the lighter ones. Explain that a bit.
So when we think about, I gave you the six minerals earlier, lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, et cetera. China basically processes between 40 and 90% of those minerals worldwide. When we get to rare earths, one of the reasons that we're so worried about China's export controls on rare earths this year is because they process about 70 to 80% of those. But as you mentioned, there's a difference between light rare earths and heavy rare earths, which are titled based on their atomic weight. China's export controls this year didn't touch light rare earths. And some of that is because there is a bigger diversification of where those light rare earths are processed globally. We see that China processes about 60% of light rare earths, but China did restrict heavy rare earths this year, and they process 99.5% of heavy rare earths when those restrictions came out, which made it virtually impossible to get a permanent magnet that didn't have Chinese heavy rare earths at the start of this year.
And why is that exactly? So, is it because it's that difficult to do so? It requires a lot of infrastructure. And, does environmental damage or the willingness to do that and tolerate that play into this as well?
You hit on a number of the reasons why China has built a comparative advantage, not even comparative, really an absolute advantage here. So the first one is just geology. The US has rare earths. We actually have the second biggest producing rare earths mine in the world. However, we don't have a lot of heavies here at home. We're particularly well endowed with light rare earths. So for even a lot of the transactions and support we've provided in the US, we know we're going to need heavy rare earths from somewhere else just because geology didn't give us everything here. The second thing is China really worked to, through very targeted strategy, which we can come back to, lined up their foreign policy to get those rare earths from around the world with their domestic industrial strategy to bring them back home to process them at home. So that was the second thing. The third thing is rare earths are actually extremely energy intensive when it comes to processing. We know that separating a ton of heavy earths, separating a ton of rare earths uses about 9 to 13 times as much energy as just taking them out of the ground. So China used decades of effort to build cheap coal-fired power that allowed them to do that. And the fourth thing is it has a really big environmental footprint, as you said. And here in the US and in a lot of European countries, we take a not in my backyard NIMBYism. And China was happy to absorb that environmental footprint in exchange for this global dominance. And it really sustained across their kind of competitive advantage. When you think about the auto industry, the EV industry they've built, they mined, they processed, and they manufactured. So they were willing to make that trade-off between environmental consequence, but to build that mine to magnet supply chain.
As you're speaking, you can almost detect the differences between China's approach to going about this and the reason why already the United States would be behind on several of the things, the factors that you just described. I think the timeline here is also important to discuss. So, when did China decide that it wanted to make this a thing? And as you answer that question, how long would it take if America did everything it possibly could to try and catch up?
So I'm going to actually contextualize that story from a US perspective and then come to China and back to the US. So in 1910, the United States opened the Bureau of Mines. And the Bureau of Mines was really the US government effort to have a coordinated approach. Remember that, it was 1939 when FDR wrote a letter to Congress and said, listen, I'm concerned that we won't have the materials we need to go to war and passed the Stockpiling Act, which we still have today. So until 1996, that Bureau of Mines coordinated our efforts. It pushed R&D, it managed data, it made sure that we had the resources we needed. But kind of in that that peace dividend, we closed a lot of those efforts. So in 1996, we closed our bureau, and that's where we really ceded our advantage in a number of commodities. Rare earths were one of those. We actually used to be a top rare earths producer. It's where we ceded our uranium advantage from being the world's top uranium producer to now being dependent on countries like Russia and producing almost no uranium. Now, at that same time, around the 1980s, 90s, China decided it wanted to become a superpower. And what it did was it used things like the Belt and Road Initiative. It used targeted investment. It used its foreign policy to get those minerals from around the world. Remember that on average, globally, it takes 18 years to build a mine from the time that we identify a deposit to the time that I'm producing. It is not an overnight industry, which is the challenge that we face today because China started in the 1980s. So it now has a 40-year advantage to where we sit today. Now, back to the US is when, there's numbers as low as 2 years. Are we going to, be able to be self-sufficient in 2 years? There's no way. And that's two reasons, right? One, we have to open new mines. And the second thing is we've got to build a lot of processing facilities to counter that dominance. And that's going to take time.